She was already 5 months pregnant when she drew him. The paper had cost more than the food she had not eaten that morning. She used it anyway. Her hands had always known what she needed before the rest of her caught up. She had stopped arguing with them somewhere around the 4th month, when arguing with anything had begun to feel like a tax she could not sustain. So when her hand moved toward the sketchbook, she let it move. The city had no interest in her. It rarely did. Cars sequenced forward without acknowledgement. Voices at the crosswalks overlapped and separated and overlapped again, the continuous noise of a place with too much to do to look sideways. Doors opened and closed with the weight of people who had somewhere fixed to be. She walked slower than all of it. Not fragility. Not surrender. She had simply accepted that her body was running a process she had not scheduled, and that the process did not care about her timeline. Paint-stained fingers. A canvas bag worn to softness at the strap. A sketchbook held against her side the way you hold something you are not willing to set on the ground. She drew people because she needed to. She gave the drawings away because that was the exchange. She made something, a stranger received it. The city was slightly warmer for 30 seconds. She had done this for years. She had never expected anything to come back. Hey, before we go further, I want to ask you something. Has your body ever done something before your brain had a chance to weigh in? Move towards something, or someone, before you even decided to? And have you ever done something kind for a complete stranger? Not for a reason, not for a return, just for that 3-second feeling of having made something slightly warmer? Drop it in the comments. Because both of those things are true of Amara right now, and they are exactly what sets everything that follows in motion. He did not belong to that street. That landed before his face did. Before anything specific registered, before clothes or posture or the angle of the jaw. He sat at an iron table outside a coffee shop, and the city moved around him the way it moves around something that has decided not to be moved. Not relaxed. Not distracted. Settled into a quality of stillness that read less like rest and more like readiness, held very quietly in the body. 2 men stood behind him. Not loitering. Positioned. Her hand was already in the sketchbook. She didn't decide. The pencil was moving before the decision arrived. 30 minutes. The scratch of the pencil. The city doing what it did. Some people don't enter a space. They interrupt it. He had interrupted that entire block by existing on it, and the interruption had a specific quality. The sense that something had rearranged itself around him, and would not fully rearrange back. When she finally looked up, he had not moved. Same angle of shoulder. Same directed stillness. She stood. Crossed the street with one hand managing her balance, the other holding the page. The chair was empty. A car door, already sealed. An engine, already pulling from the curb with the smooth indifference of a vehicle that does not wait. She stopped on the sidewalk. Looked at the space. Then at the drawing. She did not tear it out. She closed the sketchbook and kept walking, carrying the face of a man she had not reached, who had not seen her, who had left behind nothing except the specific quality of his stillness and the certainty, growing slowly in the back of her attention, that she had drawn something she was going to need later. She did not know why she was certain. She was certain anyway. The call came 2 weeks later. A number she recognized. The middleman, a voice she associated with small, discreet jobs that arrived without explanation and paid without delay. She had asked him questions twice in 2 years and received answers that were technically true and completely uninformative, so she had stopped asking. She was at her table when the phone rang. Eating crackers without ceremony. The sketchbook was open in front of her at the page she kept finding it open to, though she did not remember leaving it there. He told her there was a job. Private client, he said. Good pay. Restoration work, an old painting, fire damaged, partial photograph, some sections gone entirely. He was giving it to her. She asked why her specifically. He said the client wanted the best available for the kind of work this required. She waited for more because there was usually more with him, a qualifier, a condition, something that complicated the simple version. More did not come. She did the math without looking for paper. Rent. The medical appointments she had been spacing wider than was wise, telling herself each time that she would catch up next month, and knowing that next month had a list of its own. The items at the back of the sketchbook, written in pencil, because pencil could be erased when something became impossible, and erasing felt different from crossing out, felt more like revision than defeat. The figure he named made her set down the cracker. Need doesn't ask questions. It accepts what arrives and asks later, when the pressure has lifted enough for curiosity to fit in the room alongside everything else. She told him she would take it. The photograph arrived by courier the following morning, flat and wrapped with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. She spread it on the table without touching the edges and stood over it for a long time before she did anything else. The damage was real and specific. Fire had dissolved the lower half of the subject's face entirely, jaw, mouth, the particular set of an expression that might have told her everything she needed, and had taken a section of the background with it. What survived was the brow, the eyes, the upper arrangement of a face that had clearly belonged to someone who had decided something and let the decision settle permanently into their features. She could reconstruct from this. Technically, she could produce something accurate and deliver it, and the commission would be complete, and the client would have what they asked for. She stood there looking at it, and knew she was not going to do that. Something about the surviving portions of the face gave her the specific feeling of almost recognition, not memory, not anything she could have identified in a lineup, but the sensation of being one word away from a word. The information felt present. It felt like something she already had, in a form she had not yet located. She did not know yet what that meant. She picked up the brush. Why had the middleman given this particular job to her? The question pressed lightly against the back of her attention, quiet and persistent, the way a question settles in when it has decided it is not leaving regardless of whether you choose to engage with it. She did not engage with it. She began. She did not begin to copy. She began to understand. The distinction had always mattered to her more than she could adequately explain to the people who hired her. Copying required the reference to be sufficient. Understanding required you to find out what the reference knew and did not know, to treat the damaged image not as a deficient original but as a partial witness, someone who had seen the whole thing and could only tell you part of it, and whose part had to be honored completely before you contributed anything of your own. She honored it. For 2 days she did not paint. She looked. On the third day she picked up the brush and held it above the canvas and stopped. Not hesitation. Something more deliberate than hesitation, the specific pause of a person who has reached the edge of what the reference can provide and is standing at that edge deciding whether to guess or to wait for something better than a guess. She set the brush down. She stepped back. She looked at the surviving portions of the face, the brow and its arrangement, the set of the eyes, the quality of attention in the upper half of the image that the fire had not reached, and she waited for that quality to tell her what lived in the portions it hadn't. Sometimes accuracy doesn't come from memory. It comes from the part of your attention that has been taking notes without informing the rest of you, the part that works quietly while the front of your mind is occupied with other concerns. What she found, standing there with the brush on the table and the canvas waiting, was that the quality she needed was not abstract. It was not something she could derive from an average or locate in a reference library. She had seen it before. Not in a painting. Not in a photograph. In the open air, outside a coffee shop, across an intersection, in 30 minutes of pencil on paper before an empty chair. The face in the photograph was not the man on the street. Different generation. Different bone structure. The expression belonged to another decade. But the quality, the specific texture of composed attention held inward while remaining externally readable, she had 30 minutes of evidence for that. In the sketchbook. At the page the book had been falling open to for 2 weeks. She picked up the brush. She did not guess. She followed. The painting changed the moment she stopped filling and started finding. She felt the shift, the decisions arriving differently, the brush moving with a quality of authority that had not been there before. Not confidence. Accuracy. The distinction between those two things was the difference between performing certainty and arriving at it, and she had learned a long time ago that performing it produced work that was technically correct and emotionally false, and that emotionally false work left rooms cold. She did not leave rooms cold. Why does the face feel known? The question had been sitting under her concentration for 3 days, present and unresolved, not demanding an answer but refusing to vacate. She let it sit. She kept working. On the 9th day she stepped back from the canvas. Finished. Not done, finished. The road had completed itself. The final element had settled and the painting had stopped asking for anything more. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then she wrapped it carefully, called the middleman, and told him it was ready for collection. He said someone would come for it the following morning. She asked no questions about the destination. She set the painting by the door, and that evening she sat at her table and looked at the sketchbook and felt the specific weight of having made something she did not entirely want to release, not because she wanted to keep it, but because she had not fully understood it yet, and releasing it before understanding it felt like sending a letter before you have read it back to yourself. The courier came in the morning. She watched the painting leave. She closed the door. The question pressed harder in the silence than it had in 9 days of work. She opened the sketchbook. She looked at the page. 3 days passed. She did not hear from the middleman. She had not expected to. The commission had been paid in advance, the work was collected, the transaction was complete in every technical sense. There was nothing left requiring her attention or his. And yet she kept her phone close in a way she did not entirely examine. She told herself she was resting. Her body had legitimate grounds for that argument. 9 days of standing at a canvas, the particular exhaustion of sustained fine work, the way precision depleted a layer of her that ordinary effort did not touch. She lay down in the afternoons and let the light move and did not pick up a brush and told herself this was recovery. The sketchbook stayed on the table, open to the same page. She was not given to preoccupation. She had trained herself out of it the way you train yourself out of any expensive habit, by making the cost visible to yourself each time until the habit loses its justification. Preoccupation cost time. Time was the one resource she could not currently afford to spend on anything without an immediate return. But this did not feel like preoccupation. It felt like waiting for information she did not yet have. Like a calculation she had started and not been given all the variables for. On the second evening she sat at the table and looked at the sketch and asked herself plainly what she thought was going to happen. She was a pregnant woman who had completed a restoration commission for an anonymous private client. The job was done. The painting was gone. Nothing about that sequence had any natural continuation. No answer arrived that was worth writing down. On the 3rd day the middleman called. She picked up before the second ring. He told her the client wanted to meet her. Just her. In person. Tomorrow at noon, if she was available. She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. In 2 years of working through him, she had never been asked to meet a client directly. The work went out, the payment came in, and the people on the other end of the transaction remained on the other end. That was the arrangement, and she had found it satisfactory. She asked why. He said he didn't know. Which might have been true and might have been the version of true he had decided to give her, and she had learned not to press on that distinction because pressing never changed the answer. She wrote down the address he gave her. Looked at it for a moment after she hung up. It was on the other side of the city, in a neighborhood she had passed through but never stopped in, the kind of neighborhood that does not announce its weight but carries it anyway, in the quality of the streets and the silence between buildings. She looked at the sketchbook. She thought about what it meant that a private client, someone who operated through a middleman, who received his work by courier, who had never in 2 years required a face-to-face, had now specifically requested one. With her. Not the middleman. Her. Uncertainty doesn't weaken a moment. It makes it honest. She sat with the uncertainty and let it be what it was and did not try to resolve it into something more comfortable. She did not sleep well that night. Her mind kept returning to the face she had completed, the quality she had borrowed from a stranger to fill what the fire had taken, and to the question that had sat under 9 days of work without ever fully declaring itself. In the morning she got dressed. She left the sketchbook on the table, looked at it, picked it up and put it in her bag. Her hands had decided. She had stopped arguing with her hands. The address took her across the city in the back of an Uber, the neighborhood changing in character around her as the driver moved through streets she recognized less and less. She watched the buildings shift from familiar to deliberate, the kind of architecture that does not try to impress because it does not need to, that communicates its weight through proportion and silence rather than display. The car stopped at a wall. She paid the driver and stepped out, and stood at the gate for a moment, the address on her phone matching the intercom in front of her. She pressed the button. The gate opened before her hand had fully dropped. She had formed no clear image of what she would find on the other side. Her mind had stayed deliberately still on the subject the whole ride over, the way you keep a surface still when you are carrying something that will spill if you move too quickly. A man met her at the door. He confirmed her name without asking it, and stepped aside, and she followed him through corridors that were quiet in the organized way of a place where everything happening was happening in rooms she was not being taken to. The room she was brought to had the order of a space maintained by someone who arranged their surroundings the way a serious person arranges their thinking, functionally, without anything present for appearance alone. She registered this without cataloging it, the way you register the temperature of a room before you think about it. He was already there. She recognized him before she had fully crossed the threshold. Not his name, she did not have his name. Not his face from any photograph or record. The quality. The specific texture of composed attention she had spent 30 minutes studying from across an intersection 5 months ago, present in this room, belonging to the man standing in it, who looked up when she entered and looked at her with the directness of someone assessing a variable they had not yet resolved. He did not recognize her. There was no reason he would. On the table between them sat the painting. Uncovered. Facing her. She understood in that moment, with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than in sequence, that she had spent 9 days using this man's face to complete a portrait of someone he had lost, had borrowed the quality she found in him to fill what the fire had taken from a face that must have taught him that quality in the first place, and that she had done this without knowing either of them existed. Guided by nothing except the instinct that the information was somewhere in her, and that she needed to find it rather than invent it. He looked at the painting for a long time. She watched his face and saw the moment the controlled exterior simply paused. Not collapsed. Paused. The way a held breath pauses before it releases, 3 seconds in which the surface was not operating and what was underneath it was visible, briefly, to anyone paying attention. Power rarely reveals itself. But grief does. He collected himself. Looked at her. How did you do that? His voice was even, but the question underneath the question was not. He was not asking about technique. She considered how to answer that honestly. The photograph gave me the structure, she said. The eyes mostly. The way the brow sits. But there were sections that were just gone. And I couldn't fill those from the photograph alone. He waited. I used a different reference, she said. For the quality of the expression. The part that wasn't in the photograph anymore. What reference? She reached into her bag. Her hands had already found the sketchbook, already opened it to the page. The spine fell open there automatically now, worn exactly at that point from the number of times she had returned to it. She looked at it once and then turned it toward him and held it across the table. He took it. He looked at it for a long time. Long enough that she became aware of the particular quality of the silence in the room, which was not empty silence but occupied silence. The silence of someone processing something that does not fit the existing categories. 5 months ago, she said more quietly now. Outside a coffee shop on Arno Street. I was going to bring it to you. You left before I reached the curb. He looked up from the sketch. At her. Then at the painting. Then back at the sketch, and she could see him doing the calculation. The face in the painting and the face in the sketch, and the fact of the woman sitting across from him who had connected them without being told they were connected. You kept it, he said. I didn't know why. I just didn't tear it out. Something moved in his expression. Not quite the softening she might have expected. Something more considered than that. The look of a man re-examining an assumption he had not known he was making. He set the sketch down carefully beside the painting. The two images next to each other in the light. Stay for dinner, he said. And then, as though hearing himself, the faintest correction in his tone. If you're able to. It was not much. But it was the difference between a disclosure and an arrangement, and she noticed it, and something in her settled slightly in response. Okay, she said. The food arrived and neither of them had been asked what they wanted, which she might have found presumptuous in another context but which here felt less like arrogance, and more like someone had simply looked at the situation and determined what was needed and acted on that determination. The food was good. Simple, substantial, the kind of meal that does not ask anything of you except to eat it. She ate without making a production of not eating, which was its own relief. For a while they talked about the painting. He asked her about the process, not technically, not the way a client verifies a deliverable, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who wants to understand how a thing was made. She found herself explaining it more fully than she had expected to, the part about waiting before painting, about treating the damaged image as a partial witness rather than a deficient original, about the way the quality she needed had to be found rather than invented. He listened the way people listen when they are actually listening, without preparing the next thing to say, without the particular half-presence of someone waiting for their turn. The reference you used, he said at one point, turning the sketch over lightly in his hands. He had kept it near him since she handed it across the table. When you drew this, did you know you'd use it for something? No, she said. I didn't know what it was for. I just knew I wasn't ready to let it go. He looked at the sketch for a moment. Something in his face moved that she could not name precisely, not quite recognition, not quite something else. He would have understood that, he said, quietly. Not to her, exactly. More to the room, or to the painting. She did not ask who he was. The painting had already answered that, and the answer felt like something he was not offering openly, and she was not going to take without being offered. The conversation moved, the way conversations move when two people are finding the edges of what is available between them, carefully, with the particular attention of people who are not certain yet how much room there is. He asked how long she had been working through the middleman. She told him. He asked whether restoration was all she did, and she told him no, that she painted her own work when she had the time and the means for it, and that the means had been less available recently, and she said this plainly without performing anything around it. He did not perform anything around it either. He simply received it as information, which was more dignified than sympathy would have been. His phone began to ring. He glanced at it once and returned his attention to the table. It rang again. She watched him not reach for it, and felt the weight of what that cost. Because it was clearly costing something, she could see that in the particular quality of his stillness, the way it had shifted from relaxed to held. Whatever was on the other end of that call was not trivial. He knew that. He was choosing this room anyway. It rang a third time. You can take it, she said. I know, he said. It rang a fourth time and then stopped. Attention is the rarest currency. And the most dangerous to give, because once you have been given it fully, the withdrawal of it afterward becomes its own kind of loss. The silence that followed the ringing had a different quality than the silence before it. More deliberate. More declared. He had made something clear without saying it, and they both knew he had, and neither of them named it, and the evening continued. Outside, whatever had been trying to reach him was now doing whatever came next without him. Inside, the food was warm and the sketch was on the table beside the painting, and a pregnant woman who had walked into a stranger's house carrying 5 months of an unanswered question was sitting across from the answer, and neither of them fully knew what to do with that yet. It was she who brought it up, eventually, the pregnancy. Not because he had asked, though she had half expected him to in the careful, assessing way he appeared to approach most things. He hadn't. He had let it exist in the room without making it the subject, which she had found more considerate than most people managed. She brought it up because they had been talking for long enough that the silence around it had started to feel more deliberate than natural, and she was tired of managing it. "I'm due in a month," she said. Not as an announcement. More the way you set something on a table that has been in your hands too long. He looked at her. "First?" "Yes." A beat. "Are you?" He paused, which was the first time she had seen him pause before a question. "Is there someone with you?" "For the birth." She almost said yes reflexively, which was the answer she gave to people she did not want to worry. She stopped herself. "No," she said. "It's just me." He did not respond to that with the particular uncomfortable sympathy she had learned to expect, the overcompensating warmth of people who did not know what to do with the information and so did too much with it. He received it the way he had received everything else she said, as a fact that now existed in the room and was going to be accounted for. Some moments only make sense after they've already passed. She had not expected to tell a stranger the truth about her situation over dinner in a house she had arrived at by Uber 2 hours ago. But something about the way he listened made managed answers feel more expensive than honest ones. "What's the child's name?" he asked. She laughed a little, which surprised her, a short, tired laugh that came from somewhere genuine. "I keep telling people I'm still deciding. The real answer is I haven't been able to make myself do it yet." She paused. "It feels very final. Like once I name them, everything becomes." She moved her hand slightly, not finishing the sentence because she did not have a word for what everything became. He seemed to understand the unfinished sentence. "And the gender?" "I didn't want to know," she said. "I told the nurses I preferred the surprise." "That's partially true." She looked at the table for a moment. "The fuller truth is I was afraid that if I knew, I'd start imagining too specifically. And I couldn't afford to do that until I could." She stopped again. "Until you could afford to," he said, not completing her sentence for her. Naming what she had been circling. "Yes," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who had run out of things to say. The quiet of someone who had heard something accurately, and was deciding what to do with the accuracy. Then he reached for his phone. She did not know at first what he was doing. He had picked up the phone with the same quality of intention he brought to everything, not urgently, not dramatically, simply as someone who had arrived at a decision and was now acting on it. He made the first call and his voice shifted into a register she had not heard yet, precise and direct in a way that had a different texture than his conversation, the voice of someone operating in a system they built and know completely. She heard a doctor's name. An address that was not the clinic she had been attending, where she sometimes waited 45 minutes past her appointment time in a room with chairs pushed too close together and a television mounted too high on the wall. A time given not as a suggestion. Instructions she could not fully follow but whose shape she understood. This was not a referral. This was an arrangement. He ended the call. Made a second one. The tone changed, still precise, but underneath it something that had more weight. She heard a name spoken once, early in the call, that clearly belonged to someone no longer living. A man's name, said with the specific quality of a name that has been carried for a long time and has not gotten lighter. His father's name, she understood, without being told. The foundation named for him. She heard enrollment. Coverage. From birth. He ended the second call. Produced a check and placed it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at it for long enough that the edges of the numbers blurred, and she realized her eyes were filling and pressed her lips together, and that did not help. The number on the check was not what she had been paid for the commission. It was not in that category. It was the number of someone who had looked at her situation with the same precision he turned on everything else, and identified exactly what the distance was between where she was and where she needed to be and moved to close it entirely. She had been erasing things off a list in pencil for months. She had been spacing her appointments. She had been eating crackers for dinner without making it mean anything, and she had been doing all of this alone, and she had been doing it without complaint because complaint required an audience, and she had not wanted to locate one, and she had been holding the weight of it with the specific, quiet determination of someone who has decided that falling apart is not currently available as an option. The weight lifted. All at once. Not gradually. All at once, the way a thing releases when the thing holding it down is simply removed. A tear reached her jaw before she had decided anything about it. Then another. She pressed the back of her hand against her face, and that helped for approximately 2 seconds, and then it did not help at all. "I'm sorry," she said, which was not what she meant, and she knew it was not what she meant, and she suspected he knew it too. "Don't," he said. Gently. Not commanding. The tone of someone who finds the apology unnecessary, and wants her to know that without making her feel the correction. She pressed her palm flat on the table and breathed and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked back at him, and her eyes were still full but her voice was steadier. "I don't know how to." She stopped. Started again. "There isn't a version of thank you that's the right size for this." He looked at her for a moment across the table. "You painted my father's face back," he said. "From a burned photograph and a sketch you made of a stranger on a street. You gave that back to me without knowing what you were giving." He paused. "I think we're even." She shook her head slightly, not disagreeing, exactly. More the gesture of someone who has received something so far outside their existing scale that the scale itself needs adjusting. "The foundation," she said. "That's his name on it." "Yes. He would have." She stopped herself. She did not know what his father would have done or thought or approved of. She had painted his face. She did not know him. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that." "Because it's true," he said simply. And something in the way he said it made her understand that he was not being generous. He meant it literally. That his father would have done exactly this, and that the foundation existed because of that, and that what had just happened in this room was not incidental to that legacy but continuous with it. Real power doesn't announce itself. It arranges outcomes. And what had been arranged in this room was not a transaction and was not charity, and was not something she had a clean category for. It was a man who had looked at what was wrong and recognized in it something his father would not have been able to leave unaddressed, and had acted accordingly. She folded the check and placed it carefully in her bag. She looked up at him. Her eyes were still wet, and she did not perform otherwise. "Thank you," she said. The right size version. The one that came from the place where the weight had been. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said something to one of the men near the door, low, brief, 2 sentences, and the man left the room without a word. She did not ask what the instruction was. She would find out when she left. He walked her to the door himself. The corridor felt shorter on the way out than it had on the way in. She was aware of him beside her in the particular way she had been aware of him all evening, not crowding, not managing, simply present in the way that his presence occupied a specific quality of space that other people's did not. She had stopped trying to categorize it an hour ago. At the threshold he stopped. She turned. He was standing in the doorway with the interior light behind him, and she had the immediate clear thought that she would draw him exactly like this, if her hands were free. The threshold, the contrast, the specific quality of a man who lives at the boundary between his world and everything outside it, and has made that boundary his permanent address. She did not reach for the sketchbook. "The sketch," she said. "You're keeping it?" "Yes." Not casual. The word had the quality of something already decided, simply being confirmed. She looked at him. There was something in the space between them that she could not name, and did not try to, not the warmth of the dinner, not the precision of the phone calls, not the weight of what was now in her bag. Something that lived in the gap between what had been said and what had not, between what he had done and what it meant that he had done it, between the man at the coffee shop she had not reached and the man in the doorway watching her leave. She was aware of it. He was aware that she was aware of it. Either of them moved toward it. That was its own kind of honesty, the choice to hold the space as it was rather than collapse it into something simpler and less true. It was not comfortable. It was not meant to be comfortable. Some things are worth more as questions than they would be as answers, and she was beginning to understand that he knew that too. She stepped down from the threshold. A car was waiting at the bottom of the steps. A driver standing beside it in the particular posture of someone who had received an instruction recently, and moved on it immediately. The door was already open. She stopped. Looked back up at him. He said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The car was there because he had arranged for it to be there, the same way he had arranged everything else this evening, without announcement, because the situation required it, and he had the means, and so it was simply done. Her eyes filled again, which she had not expected. She had thought she was finished. She was not finished. She pressed her lips together and looked at the open car door and then back at him, and she did not have words for this one either, for the specific experience of being anticipated, of having a need met before she had named it, by someone who owed her nothing and had acted anyway. She nodded once. Got into the car. The door closed. Through the window she saw him still in the doorway, the same stillness as the coffee shop, as the painting, as every version of him she had encountered across 5 months without knowing she was encountering him. Still. Contained. Present in the specific way of someone who is watching something leave and has made his peace with watching. The car pulled away. She turned forward. She did not look back, not because she did not want to, but because some things are better carried forward than watched diminish through glass. Behind the wall, the phone began ringing again. The house returned to itself after the car left. The corridors resumed their organized quiet. The men resumed their positions. The machinery of the place moved back into full operation the way a held breath releases, completely, without visible transition, as though the pause had been chosen rather than imposed and was now simply over. He stood in the room with the painting and the sketch for a long time. He had commissioned the painting expecting craft, expecting the competent reconstruction of a damaged image by a skilled pair of hands. He had received something he did not have a category for. His father's face returned to him not as an approximation but as a truth, completed by a woman who had used him as her reference without knowing she was using him, without knowing the connection existed, guided by nothing except the accuracy of her own attention and the instinct that what she needed was already somewhere in her if she waited long enough to find it. He looked at the sketch beside the painting. She had drawn him on a street 5 months ago, and carried the drawing for reasons she could not have defended to anyone who asked, and then used the qualities she found in it to complete a face she had never seen. And then she had walked into this room and handed both things back to him in the same evening, without agenda, without knowing what she was handing back, with the same quality of giving freely that she apparently applied to everything, because her hands moved and the exchange felt correct and she had never once calculated the return. Some actions don't end. They continue in lives you never witness, in the quality of a morning that arrives differently because of something arranged the night before, in a child who comes into the world in a prepared space by a doctor who answers on the first ring, in a mother who wakes up the day after a dinner she did not expect and finds that the list in the back of her sketchbook, the one written in pencil, has nothing left on it that needs erasing. The phone rang. He picked it up. His voice changed on the first word, back into the full precision of what his life required, the version of himself that the evening had set aside and that now reassembled with the efficiency of long practice. Instructions given. Questions asked and answered. The thing that had been waiting outside resumed without ceremony. He did not look away from the 2 images on the table while he spoke. When the call ended he stood with both hands flat on the surface and looked at what remained. In 1 month a child would arrive into a prepared space. The space did not require a name or a gender because he had built it for a person rather than a specification, the way his father had built the foundation, not for a category of need but for the specific people standing in front of it. He had done this the way he did most things, without announcement, because the gap was there and closing it was the correct response, and the means were available, and so he had made it so. He picked up the sketch one final time. On that street 5 months ago he had felt the specific quality of being observed by someone who was not calculating threat or utility. He had filed it and moved on because the day had required his full resources. He had not known what the observation was. He had known only that it was not hostile. He knew now what it had been. A woman with paint-stained hands who had looked at him and found something worth keeping, not what he represented on that street, not the weight his presence carried in that neighborhood. Something underneath all of that. A quality he had not known was visible to someone who was simply, genuinely, looking. She had kept it for 5 months without a sufficient reason. And then she had given it back. He set the sketch down beside the painting. His world did not permit the kind of proximity that the evening had briefly made imaginable. This was not a decision made tonight. It was a fact he had made his peace with over a long time, at a cost he did not calculate because calculating it did not change it. But the child would arrive into a prepared space. The mother would have the means. The gap that had no business existing had been removed. And 2 images sat on a table in a room in his house, left exactly where they had come to rest, in the light, not filed, not relocated, simply placed beside each other by a man who had received something he had not been expecting and had decided, without making a production of it, that it was going to stay. If this story reached something in you, if you felt that specific ache of watching someone receive help they never asked for, arranged quietly by someone with no obligation to arrange anything, in the particular way that undoes you precisely because no one asked, drop it in the comments. Tell me which moment it was. Tell me where you were when it landed. Because those comments are why this channel exists. And if you're new here, this is what we do. Stories that don't perform themselves. Stories that stay with you after the screen goes dark. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. The next story is going to ask you something you are not ready for. And you will not be able to stop thinking about the answer.